It's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Lisa Green from the University of Massachusetts. I wanted to just give you a few preliminaries. I wanted to acknowledge the support we've gotten for her talk from the William Patterson University Alumni Association, from the Interdisciplinary Minor in Linguistics, which is new. Some of you may not know about it. There are some flyers here you can pick up at the end if you're interested. And also from the Department of Languages and Cultures, which is where the linguistics minor is housed. So it's my great honor to introduce you to Professor Green. She's Professor of Linguistics and Director of the Center for the Study of African American Language at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She received her PhD in 1993 at UMass Amherst in linguistics, and she's held positions at the University of Texas, Austin, and now she's back at the University of Massachusetts Amherst as a professor. She's published 2 books, which are here, and which I'll leave on the table, which you can look at afterwards if you're interested. The first book is 2002, African American English, A Linguistic Introduction, Cambridge University Press. The second one is a recent book, 2011, Language and the African American Child, also Cambridge University Press. And I see you have an in preparation book with collaborators, the Oxford Handbook of African American Language, and that's going to be Oxford University Press. She's published articles in Language Acquisition, Natural Language Semantics, Journal of English Linguistics, American Speech, and the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. She's presented at national and international conferences, and she's received 2 NSF grants and also a Spencer Foundation grant. So she's a very accomplished academic and linguist, and we're honored to have her here. And we look forward to your talk, African American English Through the Years. Thank you. There will be time for question and answers at the end, so get your questions, jot them down and be ready to ask good questions. Challenge our speaker.
Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'd like to thank you for inviting me to William Patterson University today. I was really excited when I heard that some classes, or at least one class, has used my book, so I'm really very excited. I like to give talks about theoretical notions in the structure of African American English because it really shows that this is a linguistic system and not just slang. But when I have the opportunity to talk to people who really may not have thought about African American English a lot, I'm really very excited. So I'm really excited to be here today. So what I'm going to do, though, is just give you some maybe introductory background in African American English, and I'm going to try to do that in 3 parts. So first off, I'm going to start with just an overview of hot topics in African American English. Then I want to move a little bit to talk about what African American English actually is. I want to give you some summaries of definitions that we may see in the literature, and I want to get you to understand what my view is. And then I want to end with just some introductory highlighting points about research in African American English. And then I'm going to focus on research with African American English speaking children. Because when we read about African American English, then what we basically find is that it's a variety that's associated with adolescents and young adults. So it seems like it's magic that one day you just wake up speaking African American English at 15. And so it seems that people have forgotten that kids actually acquire it the way they acquire language in general. So I'm going to end with that. Okay, now you have to promise not to go to sleep on me. Okay, all right, because I will ask you some questions. Okay, good. So I wanted to start with some hot topics in African American English. This is a particular linguistic variety that's hotly debated. And there are a number of topics that keep coming up over and over in the literature. For example, what we actually find is that there's some kind of slang hip-hop controversy. And that claim then is that African American English isn't really a linguistic system per se that's spoken by people in a particular language community. Instead, it's basically a kind of variety that's associated with popular culture, slang, hip-hop. So if you know the latest slang, then you know something like African American English. So people might say, well, I use African American English when I'm with my friends. And often that refers to lexical items, okay, from the hip hop culture, okay, or words. Another hot topic that you might read about in the literature is this separate language hypothesis. And this is then that the claim is that African American English isn't a dialect of American English per se. Instead, it's a separate language. And if it is indeed a separate language, then there are really a significant number of implications for education. That is, if it's a separate language, then do we have to provide separate courses for children who are speakers of African American English in elementary schools? And you can think about that in connection with the Ebonics debates. Another hot topic then is the topic that we saw a few years ago, and this then is related to what we saw in the papers with the Atlanta Drug Enforcement Agency. So we saw then a few years ago a big headline saying Atlanta DEA looking for Ebonics translators, because now there's crime, there are these drug wars, so now we need Ebonics translators to help us figure out indeed what these drug lords are saying. So the question, though, is whether or not you really need someone who speaks a particular variety, or whether or not you really need someone who understands the street culture, or someone who knows words that are used in this drug culture. So we saw this a few years ago. Okay? Another hot topic then is the recent innovations controversy. On the one hand, then you have proponents of a view, and these proponents will say that, look, African American English goes way back. It has roots in African languages, roots in Creoles, all right? But then there are those on the opposite side who say, well, yes, you may find pockets of African Americans who use language differently. So they may use some different constructions if you compare that to standard American English, but these are structures that are really recent innovations. If you look at African American English and or what you might have taken to be African American English spoken by, for example, ex-slaves, then you really wouldn't find the patterns that you find in today's African American English. So what you find then are basically recent innovations, and these innovations are due to perhaps segregation of African Americans. Okay? So the last hot topic that I'm going to bring up then is that about historical origins. There are a number of hypotheses about the origin of African American English. So there are two very strong camps, and these are monolithic views. So there's one camp that says, well, yeah, African American English was once a Creole. Then there's another camp, and that camp says, well, no, we have to take into consideration dialects of American English. So these are people in the Anglicist hypothesis camp. So why don't we just say just a bit about these hypotheses about the origin of African American English? Then, you know, I will have given you a background and I'll feel satisfied releasing you out into the mainstream. Okay? So one hypothesis about the origin of African American English is the Anglicist hypothesis. Okay? So the view here then is that African American English is simply a dialect of American English. So if there are some differences between African American English and, for example, mainstream American English or standard American English, then you can simply account for those differences by appealing to American English. So, for example, you might say, well, standard American English doesn't use negative concord. I didn't have nothing. But if you look at some earlier versions of standard English, you'll find negative concord. Okay? So the Anglicist view is simply that there are some differences between what we refer to as African American English and standard American English. But those differences can basically be explained away by saying, well, African Americans have simply held on to some older forms of English, while those speakers of mainstream American English have not. So there you have the differences. That's just the dialect of English in general. Another view is the Creole hypothesis. So proponents of the Creole hypothesis basically say the following: African American English was indeed once a Creole. And we have some evidence of that. In fact, there's one Creole still spoken in the United States, and we can look to that particular Creole and basically see how African American English probably started. So what's that one Creole we're referring to? Louisiana Creole is one we could certainly consider. Who said that? What's your name? Jennifer said that. I have to come back to Jennifer because Louisiana Creole plays an important role. So now Louisiana Creole is argued to be French-based, okay? Now, the Creole that we're talking about now with respect to African American English isn't French-based, it's English-based, okay? So your point is particularly important. We'll come back to that. What's the Creole we have in mind? Ooh, Jennifer is hot. I better get back to Jennifer. Who knows? What's the Creole?
Haitian Creole?
Not Haitian Creole. Oh, you got some hot people in the front. I'm usually afraid to get close to the people in the front row. But I tell you, come on, let's go to the Carolinas, coastal Carolinas, Georgia. Uh-oh. Boy. What's your name?
Devin?
Boy, these people are hot, hot, hot. Gullah. Very good, Gullah. Okay? So proponents of the Creole hypothesis like John Rickford, for example, basically argue that African American English was once indeed a Creole. So he says, you know, maybe we don't have direct evidence of this, but if we do some historical reconstruction, what we might see then is that, well, if you consider some of the situations on plantations in the United States, thinking in terms of what may have happened in plantations in Virginia, plantations in the Carolinas, perhaps then what he's actually saying is that if you think in terms of the slave populations, and if you look at plantations in which there were many slaves, that is, many more slaves in proportion to non-slaves, then what John Rickford is basically saying then is that it might very well have been the case that these slaves retained a good bit of their language. And had they been mixed with slaves who were speakers of different languages, then you can understand that perhaps they would have come together and needed to communicate. Because they had different native languages, then what they needed to do was come up with some way to communicate. And that way then was by pidgin. And so we all understand pidgins then to be basically just simplified languages. And these are languages that you might use to communicate with someone who has a language that's different from yours. It's really simplified, so not a big vocabulary. So for example, if there isn't a big vocabulary, then you understand that one word, one lexical item then will have to be applied to many things. So you can understand then why the word for grass might also be the word for mustache. So these are simplified languages. And people are just using these because they speak different languages. They have different native languages, but they need to communicate. But the claim is, and Michel de Graaf doesn't buy into this, he's a Creolist, works on Haitian, doesn't buy into this, but the claim is that when children start to use pidgins as their native languages, as opposed to, for example, some other language, maybe some other African language, when they start to use a pidgin as their native language, then that pidgin, because it's used now in all contexts, then will take on more structure and become more complex. So that means it moves from pidginhood to Creolehood. So that's the process of creolization. So that's what we have now, as Devin points out, the situation with Gullah. And so the claim is that African American English started off quite like that. Well, the question then you might have is, well, why is it so easy for me to understand speakers of so-called African American English? Okay? Well, the answer that Rickford, for example, might give is that, well, just like there's a process of creolization, there's a process of decreolization, when a Creole begins to lose its distinctively Creole features. And there are a number of social and even linguistic reasons as to why a particular Creole might undergo decreolization. So the claim then would be that African American English, while today it retains some of these Creole features that may have to do with how certain consonant clusters are produced, for example, why then there may be a focus on aspect as opposed to tense. Okay, it might be that African American English has retained some of these Creole features, but by the same token, it's lost many of these Creole features, decreolization. So that's the Creole hypothesis. Okay? Another hypothesis is a substratist hypothesis. So the substratist hypothesis is, well, it's an illusion. It's an illusion. You hear African American English and you just think you're hearing English. Okay? It's just an illusion. But if you look really closely at the linguistic variety referred to as African American English, if you do some uncovering of some of the structures, what you'll find is that the structure of what's referred to as African American English is really quite similar to the structure of African languages. And those languages then are referred to as the substrate languages. Okay? The superstrate language then is a language spoken by people of power. That would be English. But the claim by the substratists is that African American English has retained some underlying structure that's quite similar to the kinds of structures that you find in many African languages. Okay? So that's the substratist hypothesis. Okay? So these are all monolithic hypotheses. They take one particular view. It's a dialect of American English, or it was a Creole, or it really has these African kinds of features. Okay? The final hypothesis that I'm going to just mention today is a hypothesis that's based on restructuring principles. Okay? So this then may also be known as the neo-Creolist view, okay? Kind of new Creolist view, a kind of Creolist view that's not monolithic. Okay? It's a Creolist view that really admits that, well, there may be some other things happening here. So what the Anglicist proponents have actually said may be true to some extent. Okay? But basically, those who adhere to the restructuring principles hypothesis basically argue then that African American English then is a result of imperfect second language acquisition, for example, by African slaves. Okay? But although there was some imperfect second language acquisition, there still, okay, was influence from the aspectual system or other properties of African languages and Creoles. So this is a particular view that you might on the one hand say, well, it's just a view that tries to bring everything together. On the other, you might say, well, it's, you know, there are strong arguments for this, okay? So these are just hypotheses about the origin of African American English. And if you're interested in researching it, then we'd have to go back and do a good bit of historical reconstruction to really get at what earlier versions of African American English looked like. Okay? So, you know, some of you are saying, oh, I'm interested in African American English. Others of you are saying, oh, my goodness. African American English again. When are the people going to learn standard English? Do I have to hear this every year? Yes. What do you want to say, Jennifer? No, what is standard English? You stop that. Let's get to this later, okay? Okay, we'll come back to that. I hope so in the questions, people. Okay. So, but you may have some kind of negative attitude when you say that. But I really understand that sentiment. When are the people going to stop talking about this variety? Because what we really seem to be in is a cycle, a vicious one. And every so often, you say, oh my goodness, didn't we do this 15 years ago? Didn't we raise the same question 15 years ago? When I was 15, now I'm 30, do I have to hear it again? And now 45, my word, when is it going to stop? And I'll show you what I mean by the cycle. It's a bit depressing. Okay? And if you're interested in working on African American English, then there's some steps I think that could be taken to begin to break the cycle. Okay? But let me give you an idea. So in the 1960s, what you would find in literature about speakers who grew up in certain African American communities was something referred to as the deficit hypothesis. Of course, educators and psychologists didn't use deficit hypothesis, but those who looked in on them said this is precisely what they are thinking. They said, look, these speakers are speaking something that's not standard. And even beyond that, it's a deficient form of language. If these speakers are speaking a deficient form of language, then there must be something wrong with them. Maybe they're culturally deprived. Okay? Maybe they can't really understand concepts. If they're basically saying that something is over there and not actually saying the B form, or if they're talking about an event and are not actually producing the B form, if they're saying things like he running as opposed to he's running, maybe there's something wrong with these people. That was a deficit hypothesis. Okay? 19 1960s, okay, we worked on the deficit hypothesis, and lo and behold, 1970, we were right back there. Okay? That was the Ann Arbor Black English case. Okay? So in the 1970s, up until about 1979, what we actually found then was that there were claims that there were barriers to equal education due to the language that African American children in one particular community spoke. Okay? So as it turned out then, the claim was that, okay, it's not that these children have problems just because, it's that when they're being taught, the educators aren't taking into consideration that they speak African American English or a linguistic variety. Okay? So we got that together, and wouldn't you know, in the 1980s, here we're faced with this again. Well, we saw the nation's report card reported by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We saw then that black-white gaps in reading and math stopped narrowing. Okay, so there was a big divide. And the question was, well, is this due to language? But then we thought we cleared that up in 1960. Okay? Well, okay, we worked on that and we saw a bit of narrowing between the gaps. But wouldn't you know, 1990s, Oakland Ebonics controversy. Here we're just in a circle. Same thing with different names. Same thing, different names. Okay? So the Oakland, how many of you remember the Oakland Ebonics controversy? A few of you, yes, yeah. This is, you know, I'm getting fewer and fewer hands as the years go by. But this was about 1996, okay? So the Oakland Unified School District said, wait a minute. We have speakers in our schools who are not achieving academically, okay? And this may be due in part to language. So then at that particular statement, then you can imagine what happened. Okay? You can go back and look at the newspaper articles from 1996, and then you start to see jokes about Ebonics, oh, Ebonics, the bubonics, the plague, what have you, just all kinds of jokes. So the message was never clear. In 1990, if that was the kind of response, then all we can see is that we didn't really address the issue in the 1980s. If that was the response in the 1990s, most assuredly, we didn't come close to it in the 1970s. And if that was the response in the 1990s, then we can just forget about having made any progress in the 1960s. Okay? Right. So one of the problems then is that when we talk about African American English, for some reason, it's really very difficult to take the linguistic variety seriously. So in researching this particular variety, somehow we often fall to the social aspects. And those are really very important. But what we have to understand is that when children grow up speaking this variety, they're not on street corners. They're not playing games. They're learning a language just like other people learn languages, okay? So we have to be serious about documenting what the stages of acquisition are, understanding what it is the child knows when he or she knows African American English. So if you take the side of educators and say, look, I don't want this stuff spoken in my classroom. I can't tell you what to do in your classroom, but I could at least hope that you have a clear understanding of what this stuff is, okay? How to describe it. Okay? And I think that's the part we're missing. It's really very easy for us to understand that, okay, these are slang items I use when I don't want this group to understand me. And this is what, I don't want to name a rapper here, I might say the wrong one, but this is what so-and-so is using in his latest song or her latest song. So this is cool, okay? It was crunk in the 19 whatever, and it's something now. But that isn't African American English, okay? Although it has a major role in African American English, okay? All right? Especially among people who are certain age groups. How many of you know meanings of messy? Anybody know a meaning of messy? What is it?
Dirty, disgusting.
Dirty, disgusting. Any other meanings of messy? Anybody? You know, oh, look, my back people are kind of hot today. What's your name, young lady? Brittany. What's another meaning of messy, Brittany?
It could describe a person in the way that they are, maybe gossiping, things like that.
How many of you know this meaning of messy? Raise your hands. Raise them high. Okay. Aha. Okay. You didn't know that meaning of messy? You didn't know? Oh, well, oh, B. Brittany, where are you from? Philadelphia? You know Sadiddy? Who's laughing? You know Sadiddy, Brittany?
I'm not too sure.
You're not too sure?
I think maybe like flip-flop, kind of like.
Flip-flop? Shady? You know Sadiddy? Oh, I see you smiling. What's Sadiddy?
Sadiddy is like another way of saying bougie.
How many of you know Sadiddy? Not those who have taken the class here. How many of you learned it here in the class? How many of you know it? Okay. Oh. Okay, raise your hand high. Okay. Let me pick on somebody else. Let me see. Let me pick on some of this side. Oh, this side is looking pretty cool. Anybody know meanings of kitchen? What's funny?
Which one?
Not the funny one. Give me the funny one. Yeah, okay. How many of you know meaning of kitchen? A meaning of kitchen. What's your name, young lady? Simone. Who knows the meaning of kitchen? Oh, you're raising your hand high on that one because it doesn't refer to you. Okay, all right. Raise your hand again. Who knows kitchen? Okay, all right. Say it again, Simone. Yeah. The hair at the nape of your neck. Nape of your neck. That's fine. That's enough. Hair at the nape of your neck. And these are all lexical items, and I think you wouldn't find these in Webster's dictionary. Okay? You wouldn't find them in Webster's dictionary. Messy, as Brittany pointed out, messy can refer to, Jennifer said, you know, someone who's not so tidy. All right? So, sure, I'm messy. My office is messy, but I don't want to be Brittany's messy. Okay, so messy refers to a person who stirs up things, often females, right, Brittany? So some notion of gender there. Sadiddy, what's your name? Dejanay refers to bougie, conceited. These are not words in the dictionary, okay? Kitchen refers to hair at the nape of the neck, okay? So it's important to talk about this particular linguistic variety. And we can also talk about the slang elements that are used, but these are not that kind of slang. These items cross generational boundaries, okay? So I'm sure my nephew who's 30 knows crunk. I'm guessing he does. I know it because people have told me, but my mother doesn't know crunk. But we all know Sadiddy, okay? So when we think in terms of African American English, if we just want to think in terms of it on the level of words and phrases, we even have to think in terms of separating those into that particular kind of language use that may be associated with people who are of a certain age group, and then those words that cross generational boundaries. Okay? So we have then this sort of cycle that really prevents us from moving forward. And one of the reasons, I think, is that when we conduct research on this variety, we are somehow just stuck in some superficial features, okay? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just talk about some definitions of African American English, and then I'm going to give you the definition that we're going to accept in this class, in this auditorium today. So we can define African American English in a number of ways. We can take a speakers-based approach. So the speakers-based approach basically says, look, African American English is basically that variety spoken by African Americans who are members of the working class. That really is not adequate, and it's not accurate, but that's a definition you find. It's called African American English, so if you're African American, you must speak it. That's false. That's false. And the name often turns people off because they don't want to be associated with this particular variety because people have really very negative attitudes towards it. If you speak it, you must be incompetent. And now people have had the audacity to refer to it as African American English. I can't get away from it. Okay? You can call it, as I do in some of my classes, I call it Variety X. You can call it anything you like. Okay? It just so happens if you go back in the literature, and if you're looking at literature in the 1960s, you might find Negro English. If you're looking in the late 1970s, you might find Black English vernacular. If you're looking at Geneva Smitherman in the 80s to 90s, you're going to find African American language. If you look at another source, you might find African American vernacular English. If you look at my work, you will see African American English. But feel free to call it Variety X. Okay? Because people often say, wait a minute, not only African Americans speak it. Is that right? Dejanay, is that right? Give me some more information about that. How do you know that?
Because I know people who are not African American who speak this variety of the language.
What do they do to let you know they know it? I'm picking on, she doesn't mind, she's pretty strong.
I don't know, that's just how they speak.
She said that, look, those are my intuitions. These are my intuitions. Who else knows someone who's not African American English but speaks it? Brittany? Tell me something about that.
Maybe just, I think their environment, the environment that they grew up around.
Okay, all right. So their environment. So we could take someone of any ethnicity, and if that person is in an African American English speaking community, then we might expect that person to speak African American English. And when I say speak African American English, I don't mean, you know, if you decide to be cool on Wednesday, you might wake up talking cool. Not that part, okay? Not that part. But when we say speak African American English, I mean use it with some kind of native-like use, okay? Really using the syntactic patterns, phonological patterns, okay? Not just using set phrases and words, okay? So in order for that to happen, you can't just hang out with your cool friends who are African American, okay? Because not even your cool friends may not know it. They just might be cool. And you can be cool without speaking African American English, can't you? Yes? Yes? Okay, all right. So we want to make the distinction, okay? So it is indeed the case that if you're in an African American English speaking community among native speakers of that variety, then certainly you can use it. Okay? Another way to define African American English is by its features. Okay? So this definition says, look, African American English is a variety in which particular non-standard features are used. For example, there's no is form, there is no are form. Okay, so speakers then have zero auxiliary be. And so the auxiliary be, of course, is that be form, and it's going to be inflected in some contexts that will precede a verb ing, okay? Progressive. So speakers might very well say she reading too fast, as opposed to she is or she's reading too fast, okay? It's also a variety in which preverbal had is used. Preverbal had sounds like the pluperfect in mainstream and other varieties of English, but it's not the pluperfect. And we're going to see later that this is a form that's acquired by 4- and 5-year-olds, okay? But mainstream American English speaking kids and African American English speaking kids alike, these kids don't acquire pluperfect had at that age, okay? All right. So speakers can say something like, that's the test I had failed, to mean that's the test I failed, okay? If it's the pluperfect, then it has to mean that the failing, I had failed, the failing happened farther in the past. than some other event. Here, it basically has just a simple past meaning, meaning the failing was just before the speech time. Okay? So instead of being some kind of tense marker here, it's an aspectual marker. And I'll say a bit more about that in looking at it in children's speech. Okay? All right. Another way to look at African American English is what we refer to as the dual components approach. Okay? And so basically this says that African American English is simply mainstream or standard American English with some coloring or flavoring. Okay? And so basically it says, look, African American English then is basically a two-part system. There's a big system in African American English that's quite like the system in mainstream and other varieties of English. And then there's a teeny component we refer to as the African American component. You can't speak African American on its own. It has to be combined with the grammar of mainstream American English. But when you bring the two together, then you get African American English. That's quite intuitive because that allows us to see that there are some similarities between African American English and mainstream English and differences. But this is really an incorrect view. Okay? And we can see that when children are acquiring African American English, they don't really distinguish the two components. They don't say on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm going to acquire mainstream English, but then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm going to acquire the colorings or the flavorings. When they acquire African American English, they really acquire one system. Okay? So the view of African American English that I'm taking is a view that I refer to as a systems and patterns view. It says that, yes, African American English is inherently variable, but it has set syntactic, which has to do with sentence structure, phonological sound patterns, semantic meaning, pragmatic use, and lexical patterns. And these are intertwined with structures of general English. Okay? So, you know, people often talk about code switching. Okay? It's not really the case that speakers are often moving from African American English to mainstream American English, although speakers can do that. But speakers can be speaking African American English and use a structure that's also found in mainstream American English. Okay? So mainstream American English doesn't really own any structures. These are structures that may be shared by all varieties of English. All right? Okay, good. So when thinking of African American English, it's really best to think of a continuum. Okay? And so speakers of African American English may be at different points on the continuum. Some speakers may be here. Okay? All right? So some speakers then may move between here more towards general or mainstream American English, depending on the context. But not all speakers can do that. Not all speakers want to do that. Some speakers may be pretty much here. And the only way they can move in this direction may be to somehow manipulate intonational patterns. But there's no manipulation of the sentence structure. So when thinking of African American English, it's really best to think of it along the continuum. Okay? So some speakers have more access to African American English than other speakers. Okay? Okay, good. So when characterizing African American English, so here's one way to move us from that cycle or out of that cycle. In characterizing African American English, we basically stuck to this very superficial level, features. Okay? So if you look at a book, any speech pathologists in the classroom? One speech pathologist. Oh, 2, 3, oh, 4, 5, my goodness. Speech pathologist. I always pick on my speech pathologists for this. Okay? Now, I don't like features. Features, if you look at a features approach to African American English, what you'll find in a book is that African American English is a variety that has this feature, no overt copula, no overt auxiliary be. It's a variety that uses this be, I be running, okay? It's a variety that does, you're laughing, I see you. It's a variety that does a number of things, a number of features. but the features can't really describe the system. But the features are good for speech pathologists, okay? Because if a speech pathologist needs quickly to understand whether or not her client, for example, is speaking African American English or has some kind of disorder, the speech pathologist can go to that list of features and say, oh, this is consonant cluster reduction. So it really is the truth that speakers who may be adults will have F sounds for interdental fricatives, okay? All right, so if you say roof, where the tongue goes between the teeth, some speakers of African American English may say what? Roof, okay? So if my speech pathologist wants to determine whether or not she needs to work on this, okay, then she could look at the features list, take an assessment of what the child is doing, and then go from there. But features can't really describe African American English, because when children are acquiring it, they don't just learn a few features, they learn the whole system, okay? So we definitely need the features, the isolated properties. We do need to know that something happens with consonants. But we also need to move from features to patterns to understand that there are systematic uses of properties and features, that they are patterns. So it's not then that just that the speaker uses this, what I'm going to refer to as habitual B, that's never inflected. It's that they have a whole system of aspectual markers that talk about the progression of an event, whether or not an event is ongoing, whether or not it's habitual, whether or not it has ended, okay, or whether or not we're looking at a piece of the event. So it's not just that that happens with aspectual B or this habitual B. I be running so fast I don't know who's behind me to mean I'm generally or usually running very fast. Not that I am running very fast now, okay? They use it to talk about events, but it's not just that use of B, okay? It's a whole aspectual system. And so we need to move from patterns to systems, understanding then that speakers have a whole system of talking about events in that way. So if we move then from features to patterns to systems, then when we get these topics like the Ebonics controversy, like the Ann Arbor case, like the no more narrowing of the gap between the groups, then we can address that issue or those issues from the linguistics aspect structurally, and then provide more insight into the linguistic system. Okay. So now then, the last point I want to make in the definitions here is that African American English is not standard English with mistakes. But when standard English speakers, and Jennifer and I don't quite know what to say about standard English, but when standard American English speakers hear this uninflected B, I be too tired to read my book. When they hear that, they immediately think, oh my goodness, can't the speakers even conjugate B? Don't they know you must inflect it? My word. Okay, you can't use it like that. So when speakers hear that, it sounds like someone attempting to speak mainstream American English, but missing the mark. But if the speaker really wanted to say he is running instead of he be running, and if that's what the speaker meant, the speaker would say he is running or he running. But when the speaker uses be, another meaning is intended. Okay? So it may, you know, we have these attitudes toward language, and you, in your heads, you understand what it means to sound uneducated, ignorance, and sometimes that doesn't mean that you are not communicating a clear message. It could mean that your packaging is not my packaging. If you're using these uninflected B's where I use inflected B's, wait a minute, you must have an inflection problem. But there's considerable overlap between African American English and general American English, mainstream or standard American English. But there are spaces that are not included in the two systems. So if we think in terms of the tense aspect system, African American English marks the progressive. He running or he is running. That's included. In order to indicate habituality, mainstream American English really needs to use adverbials. He's usually running. African American English can couple an adverbial with an aspectual marker be. He be running. He never be running. Okay? To me, not that he isn't running now, but in general, he's never running. So if children then have to begin to acquire this whole separate aspectual system at 4 and 5, in addition to aspects like the perfect and progressive, which are also in African American English, you can imagine what a 4-year-old African American English speaker knows. Speaker doesn't have the opportunity to show that he understands this whole aspectual system. It's not taught in schools, not because it's not worthy of being taught. I mean, who could teach it? If you went to your internet now to order a grammar book on African American English because you wanted to teach a 4th grade grammar class, I don't know what you're going to come up with. Okay. If you went back and if you asked Dejanay about how to spell sedity, I don't know what she would say. Somebody else might give another spelling. We don't know who wrote it. When you write sedity, you have to write it the best way you can. But you know the meaning. So there are a number of issues about African American English and education, but it doesn't really have to do with the fact that African American English isn't systematic. It's not rule governed. So here, there, and if you're, for those who are linguistically inclined, there are a number of points here, bullet points here, that really talk about the differences in systems. Not that mainstream American English uses an inflected B, African American English doesn't, but there are differences then in the systems. Okay? All right? Okay? So now then, I'm going to just give an example of African American English being systematic, and I'm going to use an element from the slang component, because even the slang is systematic. Okay? All right? I learned a lot in looking at these get possessive pronoun exon. I said, I'm not a native speaker user of the, oh, I'm sorry, what'd you say? Did someone say something? No? Oh, okay. I'm not a native user of get possessive pronoun exon, but I said, let me study this to see if I can find if there are any patterns here. Have any of you heard this get your exon thing before? You've never heard this. You have. No, is anyone else? You've never heard this? Some people haven't. Who's never heard get your drink on or get your something on? Few people have not. Some people have not. So you're learning with me. It's pretty old, though. That much I do know.
Oh, I thought you meant get your ex on, like they said. Like,
oh, did you talk out like that? Wow.
No, when you said get your ex on, I thought you were saying like get your ex on. I didn't know you meant like examples. Like.
So what do I really mean? Give me an example. Give me a good one. Not one up there. Give me a good one. What are you going to get on? Give me a good one. Come on.
I say one of those.
Choose a good one.
Get my drink on.
And what do you mean?
Having a good time.
Having a good time. Very good. Excellent. See, that's very good. Okay. So here then, here's the structure. He's real. What's your name? Dominique. Thank you, Dominique. It's really good. What he just did, he said, this is kind of funny. You're putting this structure in, you're putting this in get possessive pronoun X. Seriously? But really, let's try it. Now, I was reading Essence magazine in the 1990s, and one woman said she was going to get her hydrotoning on. I don't know what she meant, but it sounded very good to me. Okay, it was good. It was some water or something. So I said, this is wonderful. So I took that example. But now I just want to go through, and I want to see then how, and we're going to end in a few minutes, so don't worry. Okay. So I just want us to go through how even this is systematic, okay? And then we're going to move to some heavier details, okay? But don't go to sleep on me. It won't be too much longer. So if we really wanted to do, like Dominic, if we really wanted to do a project to figure out the grammatical class of X, get your X on to figure out what you can plug in X. We know we can plug in drink there, but we could go through the steps. We could go through some linguistic tests. We can say the thing that goes in the X space follows the possessive pronoun. Your drink, your book. And when you follow a possessive pronoun, then you're a noun, okay? Another test, it occurs in a phrase that follows get. Get your book. Get your X. Get your drink. Here, we see that that thing in the X space definitely seems to be behaving like a noun. And then if it's a noun, we expect to modify it with an adjective, okay? So we can say, get your big book. We can modify book with big, adjective. We can say, get your heavenly praise on. Not just your praise, your heavenly praise, okay? Modifying this then with an adjective. And even if you go to the best man, you'll find examples. What if she did go out and get her little swerve on? You don't have to know what swerve is, but if you can modify with lil, okay, who knows what lil means? Yes. It doesn't mean a tiny swerve, does it? Who knows what lil means? What does it mean? Yes, ma'am.
It means like just a bit. It doesn't mean like a small proportion, but I mean like if you're trying to say get like dang,
It's hard to explain.
like she's saying her little swerve on, like she going to dance or whatever, but like not too crazy, but not I don't know.
It's very difficult to explain. We'll come back to it. You know it, right, right. Who else knows what lil means? What does lil mean? Yes, sir. A little? Just to get your teeny, it's not a big swerve, but a teeny swerve? Teeny, who thinks it means teeny?
No, it's a bit, but not small.
Moderate, who else? Does anyone mean? We better get off of this. Okay, we'll come back to lil. Okay, we'll come back to lil. Has a special meaning, okay? Nevertheless, it's an adjective there. So basically what we've seen then is that the X thing can be occupied by a noun, okay? The X can be occupied by a noun. But if X can be a noun, for some speakers, this really sounds terrible. I'm going to get my car on. Who thinks that's funny? Would you use it, Dominic? No. No. Okay. So why is it then that if we've shown that this thing can be a noun, what makes this bad? Let's see what makes it bad. Most people agree with Dominic, I have to tell you. Okay? So here then, basically, we're going to see why get my car on is bad. So what we find is that get my chill on can be substituted then. We can actually put in this space a verb. So I'm going to get my chill on simply means something like I'm a rest or I'm going to rest. Okay? But you can't say I'm a pocketbook. Okay? To mean that I'm going to do the pocketbook, whatever that means. It seems then that not only does that X thing have to be a noun, but it also has to be able to function as a what? Who said that? Verb. Verb. That's the problem with get my car on. So I thought I solved this problem in 2002. And then I was just reading something on the internet, and lo and behold, Miss Jennifer Hudson said the following. When people say, I want to get my J HUD on, or they want to go to the gym, and I'm the role model for blah, blah, blah. So she was talking about what made her really feel proud. So now it seems that J HUD is a noun. But why is that not so bad? What exactly does the get your, oh, this, you so hot, young man. What does get my J HUD on have to mean? Something like what?
Like J HUD, like a representative for like another verb. So it's what J HUD represents.
Okay, good, very good. Who else wants to add something? Excellent. What?
I think it means to lose weight.
All right, very good. The J HUD then means something like verb. Very good, excellent. Represent, do something, lose weight. Very good. So I'm just saying then that when speakers are even using this creative language, they're not using it haphazardly. You're not going to buy it from me, but you're going to buy it from Dominic. He can sell you on this. When he says, I wouldn't use, I'm going to get my car on, you better follow him, okay, because he knows. And so what we can see is that there really is a system even in this component, okay? So now what I want to do is just make some general points about African American English and code switching, and then I'm going to end with some comments about child language acquisition. Okay? So basically, when speakers then are speakers of African American English, then it's not that they're negotiating between the ungrammatical and the grammatical. If they are code switchers, they're negotiating between the different, okay, varieties. Okay? So dialect A speaker may say she be reading too fast. Dialect B may say she usually reads too fast. Okay? Can't say this is ungrammatical unless your target is mainstream American English. If your target, if you're going for that, then it's ungrammatical. But if you're speaking African American English, it's not ungrammatical. Okay? So basically then, it's been argued that African American English has a good bit of camouflage, that they're American English looking forms, but they have different meanings. So to the naked eye, they just look like American English forms, but speakers understand them to be different. Okay? So here's one. So in African American English, it's often the case that auxiliaries, finite auxiliaries, are omitted. So speakers can say something like, she been having that car for a long time. Okay? All right? Now, speakers who are aware of African American English then understand immediately that, oh, I better put my auxiliary in. But what they don't always get is that in mainstream American English, have doesn't always like to occur in the progressive. So they don't really address this progressive having. They simply stick in the has. And for those speakers, they seem to be speaking mainstream American English. Okay? So instead of saying she has had that car for a long time, they put have, state verb, in the progressive. English doesn't really like state verbs in the progressive. Okay? I am knowing you for a long time. Okay? There's very special uses of those, right? So I also have data with this use of aspectual be. It's really quite problematic for speakers who want to speak mainstream American English. So because this be has strong habitual meaning, speakers continue to use it, even though their goal is to use mainstream American English. So the speaker said he won't allow us to wear pants, and he doesn't even be there. Okay? So to make this more standard, the speaker uses the auxiliary that agrees with third person singular subject, but keeps the aspectual be there. Okay? All right? So in these cases, what we have then are actually ungrammatical constructions, not because they include constructions that are associated with African American English, but because the speakers are not trying to speak African American English, they are really trying to distance themselves from it. Okay? But these forms have such strong meaning, this ing and be, that they actually stay even when they are trying to use mainstream American English. So this is incorrect, okay, because the target is mainstream American English. Okay? 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 So I'm going to just now say a little bit about code shifting or shifting. Okay? So here, African American English speakers can be argued to code shift. But not all instances of using what you see in American English are instances of shifting. Okay? I'll give you one true instance of code shifting. So the third person singular S really is not part of the grammar of African American English. So she read, he read, they read, we read. Okay? All right? When speakers use this S, she reads, this is a real instance of moving from African American English to mainstream American English. This isn't part of the grammar of African American English. Okay? Speakers then use this aspectual marker, but they also use this one. This is not a shift from African American English to mainstream American English. This is just a shift within African American English. Usually it really doesn't belong to just one system. Okay? So when we talk about this code shifting, we can talk about shifting from African American English to a different code, mainstream American English, but we can also talk about shifting within African American English to something that also occurs in mainstream American English. Okay? So the last part here then, so we've given some general overview points of African American English. Now I want to just focus on child African American English. So we haven't really done a good bit of research on this area, but I bet some of our speech pathologists will be able to talk about child African American English because we're interested in what the children do when they're developing language. Okay? So if we wanted to figure out, okay, my child is 2 years old, he's a native speaker of mainstream American English, he's a native speaker of French, what should he be doing at 2? Well, you go to Brown somebody and look it up and say, oh, this is what 2-year-olds are doing. If you have a child who's growing up in an African American English speaking community, what should the child be saying at 2? What should his inventory of sounds at 18 months be? And at 4, what should the child be doing? What should he be producing to be considered a normally developing speaker of African American English? So what we were interested in figuring out exactly when children acquired aspectual B. Okay, this B I've mentioned, the one that means habituality. So we designed a number of experiments to figure out when children learned this aspectual B. We started off with SpongeBob. I said, oh, SpongeBob, that was problematic for a number of reasons. We quickly moved away from SpongeBob. I'll talk more about that in the workshop. Okay? Okay, good. So just to make sure you understand, when we talk about this aspectual B, we're talking about a marker that's used to show that an eventuality is really well established, such that it's like habit. He be talking, usually habit. She be making A's on her test. You know, that means if she has a test tomorrow, you expect an A. Okay? All right? So we wanted to see, because this is really, really, really strong in African American English, we wanted to see when children use it. Okay? So if you say this printer be printing 25 pages per minute, you better have evidence that it can do this. If you say this printer prints 25 pages per minute, you can say that to me and it's in a new box and has not been opened. Okay? And I can take your word for it. You said that, I'll purchase it. If you say to me this printer be printing 25 pages per minute and it's in a new box, I'm going to think you took it out, printed that, understood that it does that, and then put it back in the box. Okay, and tried to sell it to me. All right, so in mainstream American English, there is that ambiguity. This printer prints 25 pages per minute can mean that, yes, indeed, it can print 25 pages per minute. Okay, but if you say it be printing 25 pages per minute, it has to have actually done that, such that it's a general habit. Okay, so when speakers are learning African American English, they really have to understand that this is what happens. So I'll go over one experiment here. And then I'll just talk about some other data and then I'll end. So in order to figure out if kids really do understand aspectual B at 3, 4, and 5, then we devised experiments. We could not complete the experiments with 3-year-olds. That's just too young. Okay? But we did find that by 4, children are developing this marker and understand it. And they're different from their non-mainstream American English-speaking peers. So here's a scenario. So there's little Bruce. Bruce has a box of toys he keeps in the garage. So you see his box of toys there. If there's no car in the garage, he plays with the box of toys there. Sometimes John, you see John there, John comes over and he and John play with the toys from the box in the garage. But today, Bruce has to move his box of toys to the porch because he's keeping a box of John's baseball stuff in the garage. What box be in the garage, we ask the children. Okay? So here then, you'll see, oops, okay, what box be in the garage? What would you say? Who said something? What box be in the garage?
John's baseball stuff.
Who says the other box? John's baseball stuff? What box be in the garage?
I would say toys.
Toys. Toys. It's not there now, but it's the one that's usually there. Okay? Very good. And so we had to determine whether or not kids actually get that. They get that. Okay? So here's one more chance. Faye rides her bike to school. She rides her bike to school almost every day. Yesterday, she had to walk to school because her bike was broken. Today, Faye gets a ride to school because her Aunt Peggy wants to show Faye her new car. how does Faye be getting to school? Okay.
Today, Faye gets to ride to school because
So
her Aunt Peggy, remember Aunt Peggy wants to show her a new car, so today she gets to ride to school with her Aunt Peggy. But how does Faye be getting to school? Riding a bike. Good. Every day she rides a bike. Every day she rides a bike. You like it too? You ride your bike too? Yeah. Right now, she rides there walking to school. Okay. Sometimes Daddy walking to school too.
Okay, so here then we can hear that children even produce these aspectual B's in their spontaneous speech. So we see then that by 4 or 5, they at least have above 50% comprehension of this aspectual B, which is quite complicated. So they're beginning to produce it. So we have some evidence then that children are beginning to produce aspectual B by 4 and 5. So that's just one experiment, and I'll talk about some other child language in the other in the later workshop. But now I'm just going to go to, these are just other slides that I will play later, just about the sound system. But now I'm just going to go to the very end here, okay, because I know you have to go, and just give a summary. So the last part, I'll talk about these slides in the workshop. These are just data from child language acquisition, but that was just to give you an idea. And I wanted to stop there because I wanted to be clear that certainly we are in this cycle of just going over the same old stuff in African American English. But if we move beyond just sort of naming or listing features to trying to describe the system that speakers use, then we'll make some advancement. So there's discussion about African American English and society, whether or not it's a dialect versus language, what are social uses of language. We're clear about that, I think. But we're moving beyond that to talk about debates about its historical origin, to really get some understanding then about how this variety originated. And we're moving from the monolithic approaches to take into more consideration. And then in making advances in description of African American English, we're beginning to describe the linguistic system. In particular, we're making advances in child African American English. And I think that's really important to help us move forward in the study of African American English. Okay, I'll stop there.
We have a few minutes for questions. If people have questions, we'll take as many as we can until it's maybe 5-10 minutes.
This one, maybe.
All right, I have 2 questions because I came late. I probably
Stand up and talk loud.
Sorry, I have 2 questions because I came late. Did you describe the difference between Ebonics and African American English? Is Ebonics actually just another way of saying African American English, or no? Thank you. All right, is Ebonics another way of saying African American English, or is that something totally different in general?
I think now people are using African American English and Ebonics interchangeably. I try to avoid that because when Robert Williams coined the terms in 1970-72, basically he used Ebonics to refer to varieties of languages that had some kind of connection to African languages. So it wasn't just used for varieties that had English influence. And in fact, what I think he tried to move away from was associating the variety with some English, sort of a connection. So, but now, given the Ebonics debates, people are using them interchangeably. Yeah.
My second question was, with the historical origin, wasn't it after pretty much like the slavery days with the Jubba Jive? I remember reading that in one of your books. So I just wanted to make sure, like, is that still the study, or have we found, like, more?
Yeah, I mean, that's one hypothesis, that it has these sort of Creole origins. Another is that it has more African language origins. So there are a number of hypotheses about the origin of African American English. And some of the hypotheses basically say you don't even have to look to African languages or Creoles. They're just different views. We really haven't gotten our feet dirty, our hands wet, and going back to do reconstruction to figure out what the actual origins are. But I think we're getting closer to that. But there are many hypotheses about the origin. Some do a better job of accounting for the data than others. Yeah, you're welcome. Oops. Looks like they're Oh, this young lady.
What made you interested in this topic?
Yeah, I was doing my master's in English literature, and I knew that was not what I was looking for. So when I was an undergraduate, I had taken one course in linguistics. I don't know why, maybe to fulfill some requirement. And I really liked linguistics because it really gave me the opportunity to look at language in a different way. And then when I was working on my master's, I took a course on Zora Neale Hurston, and I realized that she was doing something in her language that wasn't captured by other authors of the same period. And those authors were trying to represent the speech of blacks or the folk. And so then I thought, you know, I would be less bored if I put literature and linguistics together. And so my master's thesis was on language and Zora Neale Hurston's work. And then I decided to do a PhD in linguistics. But I grew up in an African-American English-speaking community. And I understood early on that what I did in my very small segregated community in Southwest Louisiana wasn't what other people were doing, even in that same town. And so I knew that there had to be some systematic differences. And I also knew that I wasn't stupid because I was performing really very well in school, but I could speak a different way. And so I think I've always been interested in language, but it wasn't until I got to not just undergraduate school, but to do my master's that I understood that, oh, there are communities of people who talk like this and people are even writing like them. So let's see what we can do. Yeah. Oh, now she's going to take the mic. I forgot. I'm sorry. I took over. That's okay. Oh, and then we have this young man. Okay, you'll have this lady and then this young man. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I have one comment and one question.
Okay.
So the comment is, as a speech language pathologist, we do look at patterns and systems. We do look at patterns, and we are trying to learn the systems.
Yes.
I'm very happy to see your research, although just a little bit about the study on the system. And then that's my comment.
Thank you.
And my question is, you talked a little bit about the code switching and the special features of code switching in African American English. And I want to, so on one side, you think African American English is a system, and which is different from standard English. And on the other side, you think it's a continuum. And how would you if we are talking about, if we compare the code switching between, say, Chinese and English, and the code switching between African American English and the so-called standard English, then what?
Yeah. So that's always a very interesting topic because, I mean, we've done a really good job of studying code shifting in languages that are very different. I mean, because we can look at a number of patterns. I mean, especially when we think in terms of Chinese and English, if we just look at sort of the aspectual markers in Chinese already distinguishing that from English. But now African American English, the differences are so subtle. You know, the same words may be used, but there are differences in meaning. So they're really very subtle differences. And so what we seem to see, though, in African American English is that there is considerable overlap. But we can't just say that there's overlap because there are two words that have basically the same kinds of meaning. There are very subtle differences, and then there's overlap. So in order for us to really understand, we already know, we have a good idea about what the differences are between Chinese and English, even beyond lexical items. In order for us to really get a clear fix on when a speaker who speaks African American English is code shifting to standard or mainstream American English, we first have to understand what the system of African American English is. When we understand what the system is, we find then that there's some similarities and differences between the two. So just because we find something that's extremely different between African American English and mainstream English, then it doesn't mean that all of the code shifting, okay, will be like that, all right? So there's subtle differences, but in order for us to see what the code shifting is, we have to see that, okay, well, this occurs in mainstream American English. It's never in the grammar. Speakers just generally don't produce this, okay, in African American English, yeah.
Would you say it will be easier for a child to code switch between African American English and English, or a child that have a different sex?
Yeah, Children. I mean, yeah. So in African, I can tell you are close to education. This comes up all the time because in the classroom, teachers say, you know, my kids code switch all the time. They're African American English speakers, they code switch all the time. Then I'm thinking, well, if they're code switching all the time, why are we talking about there's a problem or difference with language? If kids can automatically do this, what's the problem? They can't automatically do it if they're not also in environments in which they really learn mainstream American English. So it will be difficult for some children to code switch from African American English to mainstream English if it's not pointed out to them that, look, this is an aspectual marker in African American English. This doesn't happen in mainstream American English. So they really have to go through some of the same kinds of lessons that speakers who speak languages totally different from mainstream American English have to. It's just that the differences are so subtle, and that's the difference, yeah. So that's a very good question, yeah. This young man?
Yes, young doctor. My question was just, is there any correlation between the social classes? Do we tend to see lower class speak more this way, middle class?
I think most of the research, the early research on African American English was conducted on speakers who lived in what's referred to as inner cities and big cities. So for a while we weren't even looking at speakers who were in rural areas, okay? And so, yeah, and so most of the work was done on sort of working class. But now there's just a new body of work on what it means to be middle class and a speaker of African American English. I mean, you'll find, I mean, I don't know how people define class. You know, I don't know if I have a class or not, but I'm a native speaker of African American English. So, you know, it's just, yeah, it's interesting, so to speak. But most of the works, it started off on, you know, inner city areas, and there was a correlation, you know, of saying, okay, working class will speak African American English. But, you know, we find some differences now. It's a good point. Good question. You're welcome. Yes,
just out of curiosity, I'm just wondering if you've done anything or if you're planning on doing anything with Caribbean American English.
I haven't, but there are a number of linguists who actually do work. I don't know if you've heard of, in some of your readings, maybe you'll see work by Renee Blake at NYU. Yeah.
It's very, when my mom brings all her Caribbean friends over, I just can't understand a single thing.
You can't understand a single thing they say.
My dad, who's a native speaker of Turkish, forget that.
Oh, I think we have the best person to do the work sitting right here. My goodness. Oh my goodness. You could, what's her name? Ariel. I will look for you. Yeah. Yeah, but I know there must be a lot of interesting linguistic activity there. Yes. Yeah.
And between the island speakers.
Yes.
And that's
ridiculous. That's the, you know.
I mean, if you talk about oil down and curry chicken, we're all good, but anything else.
But this is good. I mean, what you're bringing up is a really nice problem about the Creole continuum. If you want to talk about the continuum, then you'll have to look at the Creoles to really see what it means to be way over here. Like, I'm assuming you're talking about your mom here, and then you may be way, 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 way on the other end. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. So we have, oh yes, sorry. Oh yes. Okay.
I noticed that people also perceive people who speak English who are immigrants, sort of like with accents, as ungrammatical and as incompetent as well. So the trend that I'm noticing is that people who speak other forms of English that are associated with people of color
are
the ones that usually people perceive as incompetent.
Mm-hmm. Yes. This is a hot topic, and we're going to end there. No, but you're right, and what you're pointed out is so very clear. Are you a linguist?
I'm more social psychology.
Oh, well, you're something. But this is a really excellent point. It really gives us some insight into attitudes towards language, and sometimes the attitudes really don't match up with the actual language used. But you've just opened up a big can of worms with respect to attitudes towards language. Very nice point. Very nice observation. Keen observation.
Well, thank you again to our speakers.